Today we're going to talk about metaethics, the study of how we debate, define, and think about foundational ethical ideas like goodness and truth. For this video, we're interested in the idea of the good. Who gets to define goodness? Where do those definitions come from? Are they rules of the universe, or are they entirely up to individuals? Most of the ethicists we'll talk about are interested in doing the most good, so that's a given. The question, though, is how we measure the other axis. Who or what can be the best arbiter or judge of goodness? The first answer we'll look at is idealism. The Greek philosopher Plato offers us a starting place. Imagine a group of people in a cave looking at a wall. Behind them, there's a fire. Let's put someone in front of that fire, but behind the people. If you ask those people what they see, they'll tell you that they see a man, but what they're really seeing is a shadow. The goal of philosophy, Plato says, is to get them to recognize that a shadow is not the true form of a person. It's just a reflection. We want to get them to recognize that the better form of the person is behind them, lit up by the truth of the fire. Or, even better, we want them to leave the cave entirely and replace the fire with the sun. Each of these steps toward the brighter light of truth reveals a truer and truer form of reality. So, the more we see the real form of the world through the light of truth, instead of the shadows of misperception, the closer we get to the ideal. If we were to zoom in on the place where this asymptote reaches the line of the ideal, we might get different answers from different idealists. Some of them might say that with the right study or practice, we can know the truth. Others might say we can get close, but never quite reach it. Where do those forms come from? Are they rules of the universe? Are they dictated by a divine being? Regardless of the origin of these ideals, an idealist's definition of true goodness is that it is external and absolute. How does this help us know what good is? Well, we know cake is good, but is it the ideal form of goodness? Probably not. Being a doctor does good, but would we say the ideal form of being human is to be a doctor? That's probably not quite right either. The ideal good would have to be the good in and of itself, a culmination of all the goods like beauty, truth, and justice. How do we get there? By being the form of a human, of course. That means emphasizing the part of us that, according to Plato, sets us apart from other animals. And that, Plato says, is self-reflection, the ability to think and to have control over our baser instincts. But what happens if we don't believe in an ideal? How do we know what it means to be good if there isn't a rule outside of human existence telling us what good means? Contractualism suggests that the answer lies in authority. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who lived during the English Civil War. The Puritans decided that the king was not upholding his obligations, while the Crown countered that they were the king, so sawed off. Unconvinced by this argument, the Puritans responded by overthrowing the government. Hobbes was a royalist, but he believed the monarchy had the authority to decide what was right, not based on divine mandate or any other principle, but because they were the authority. People's agreement to authority, he argues, gives that authority validity. You can't just go cutting off authority's head when you disagree with it, because that undermines the very fabric of society. Society exists to keep us out of what Hobbes calls the state of nature, where life is nasty, brutish, and short. In the state of nature, everyone has their own definition of goodness, and it will inevitably be selfish. No external and absolute goodness here, just violence. When we come together, we agree to give up some of our autonomy in exchange for security. We invest that autonomy in authorities who can tell us what goodness means. So, for a contractualist, goodness depends on experts and authorities in goodness, whether they're spiritual or civil leaders. Note, this doesn't mean we agree with individual laws or even with individual rulers. Rather, if there isn't some sort of ideal definition of goodness, the only thing that holds society together is an agreement in the principle of institutions and their authority. When we designate an authority, we agree to the principle that we are all willing to give up our individual definitions of good in favor of social stability. We might agree to a democracy, or a theocracy, or a felinocracy, but so long as that authority carries the weight of agreement, they can provide us with a stable definition of goodness. But wait a minute. Isn't it a fallacy to say the people in charge are right just because they're in charge? And what about room for alternative definitions of goodness? John Stuart Mill, a British philosopher in the 19th century, argues for what we're going to call liberalism. The idea that everyone has a right to argue for their own definition of goodness, even and especially if they're wrong. Mill gives two main arguments for this. First of all, nobody should be so sure of themselves as to think they will be 100% correct about the definition of goodness. Secondly, even if someone is totally wrong, we get closer to the truth as we explore why they're wrong. It's even possible that the truth is some kind of conversation between the two, that both of us are a little bit right and a little bit wrong. Now, this doesn't mean that Mill believes everyone is right. Some definitions of goodness are more sound than others because they're more scientific, more ethical, more applicable to reality, and so forth. So it's not that everyone's different opinion is equally correct. They're just entitled to be wrong. And it's through the back and forth of conversation that our definition of good becomes more and more refined. Is it heading toward a line of ideal goodness, like Plato? Well, no, because like Hobbes, Mill doesn't necessarily believe in ideals. But he also very much disagrees with Hobbes' belief in authority. Being in charge does not make you right, Mill argues, and in fact, it's profoundly important to question the opinions of the majority. This is because while he is not an idealist, Mill is rather optimistic that together we can create more and more refined ideas of what goodness can mean. But our last philosopher, the German Friedrich Nietzsche, will have none of that. As a nihilist, Nietzsche objects to the category of good altogether. He doesn't believe in external metrics, or in a need to agree to anyone's rules, or to listen to the wrong opinions of your neighbor. He believes only in what he calls will to power, the capacity to affect and be affected by the world around you. Nietzsche objects to the imposition of any moral categories on actions, and instead celebrates a different category that he calls nobility. Nobility is strength, pride, and action. Amoral in that it is unconcerned with whether an action is right or wrong. There's a lot more to be said about Nietzsche, but that's the most important part for us to understand in terms of metaethics. Nihilism says there is no such thing as goodness. So we have idealism, which believes in external absolutes, contractualism, which believes in authority, liberalism, which believes in conversation, and nihilism, which believes in, well, nothing. All of these different definitions of goodness are probably at play all around you all the time. Sometimes we do things because we think they're the right thing to do. Sometimes we think things are good because we're told to do them or because we've talked them through with others. And sometimes we just do things. What then are we supposed to do? Well, that is what we call normative ethics, and that's a subject for many, many other videos.